Welcome to the Convergence podcast. The Convergence is a space designed for university and college students, post-secondary students, and young adults to explore and deepen their faith. It's a space to think, question, doubt, and hopefully, ultimately, to worship. So glad you're here.
Hello, fellow story readers, story lovers, and storytellers. Welcome back to the Convergence podcast. February's Convergence was such a treat with our very own Steph and Alexandre bringing a beautiful word on becoming like Jesus, the storyteller or author. It's going to be a feast of enjoying and engaging our hearts, our minds, our souls, and strength in the life of the imagination. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, so today I'm really excited to welcome our guest speaker today. If you know anything about Steph, she is a wonderful, not only actor, but she is one of our very own UCM staff members, and she is coming here today to give you a word on becoming like Jesus, the author, the storyteller. So let's all welcome her today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that beautiful time of worship. I really enjoy that, just like all in community, thinking about how much we love our Savior. Surprisingly, I have a lot to say tonight, so I hope I get this done in time, and if not, Kelly, you can just use the hook. We're good. Working? Okay, awesome. Okay, so one of my favorite writers is C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to talk a lot about him tonight, so if you're more of a Tolkien guy, like Cody Matchett said a few months ago, I'm more of a movie Tolkien guy, but I read a lot of Narnia, so I'm going to be talking more about Lewis tonight. And so my favorite book in this series when I was a kid, it wasn't Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I know that's kind of like contentious, but it was A Horse and His Boy. I remember next to nothing about this book. I think I just like the idea of talking horses, and that's where I was rolling with that. But I do remember this scene, and so it's when we meet the character of Aravis, who is an excellent storyteller. And she grew up in the neighboring country of Calormen, and Lewis writes, "For in Calormen, storytelling, whether the stories are true or made up, is a thing you're taught, just as English boys and girls are taught essay writing. The difference is that people want to hear the stories, whereas I never heard of anyone who wanted to hear the essays." So naturally, I've written you an essay tonight. But I wanted to start tonight off with some honesty. I was going to start off with a quote from Gladiator 2, but I feel like that's a bit too niche, so I'll spare you from that. But what I wanted to be honest about, and what I felt like the Lord wanted me to share, and I know you can kind of see it, my hands are shaking a little bit, is that it is a big stretch for me to be up here. I do have a lot of anxiety when it comes to public speaking, to a concerning degree. I've preached in front of like 14-year-olds before, but that's fine because they're not really paying attention. But a story that I strongly believe is that I don't have anything worth saying. And I wanted to share this because I've spoken with a lot of you. And I know a lot of you, and I know that a lot of you guys are in the exact same boat. But when we're talking about becoming like Jesus, the storyteller, so one of the many theses I have floating around tonight, that's TH, theses, is that we all have a story to tell. And it is important that we tell them. And I believe that we are called to tell them. So again, C.S. Lewis, in his book, Surprised by Joy, he shares the story of his early life. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, "I have been emboldened to write my story because I noticed that a man rarely mentions what he thinks to be his most individually specific experience without receiving at least one, often more, of the reply, 'What? Have you felt that too? I always thought I was the only one.'" Stories are a wonderful connector. They help us to relate to one another like nothing else. So in sharing this part of my story, I just want to say that you are not the only one. And I'm grateful that you're here and the stories you've shared with me, because you've made me feel like I'm not the only one too. So since we've established that we're all in the same boat, I was wondering if you would do something with me. One of my favorite speakers, Cody Matchett, who was here a couple months ago, he does something that I think is really beautiful. As we are embodied beings, this is kind of where church and theater school come together for me. We're embodied beings. And to posture ourselves before reading from the scriptures, he asked that if you are willing and if you are able, would you stand as we read the word of God? So I invite you all to join me. So this is a story that Jesus told, and this is from Matthew 13. And he says, "So later that same day, Jesus left the house and sat beside the lake. A large crowd soon gathered around him, so he got into a boat. Then he sat there and taught as the people stood on the shore. He told many stories in the form of parables, such as this one. Listen. A farmer went out to plant some seeds. As he scattered them across his field, some seeds fell on a footpath, and the birds came and ate them. Other seeds fell on shallow soil with underlying rock. The seeds sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow, but the plants soon wilted under the hot sun, and since they didn't have deep roots, they died. Other seeds fell among thorns that grew up and choked out the tender plants. Still other seeds fell on fertile soil, and they produced a crop that was 30, 60, and even 100 times as much as had been planted. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand." Thank you. You may be seated. So, Lord, tonight may we have ears to hear, may we listen and understand, and may the words and stories that you have spoken take root in our hearts like a seed in fertile soil. Amen. So we're going to talk about this parable in more detail in a little bit, so stay in the boat with me. But we're talking like becoming like Jesus the storyteller, or becoming like Jesus the author. We couldn't decide. So we'll jump between the both. I do have one picture in my head of how tonight's going to go, and it's that guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And you know when he's standing in front of that conspiracy board, and he's like, we're going to jump around a lot, so welcome to my brain. Okay, so first question. Why are stories important? Does anyone have any thoughts on what is important about a story?
They carry some truth.
They carry truth. That's good. Or a plot. Or another question is, what stories have been important to you? Has there been a film or a book, something that's spoken to you recently? Yeah.
Hacksaw Ridge.
That's one of my favorite films. I was just talking about, I love war movies. I don't know why. It's a deep obsession that I have. Maybe I should. I'm a little worried about that. But awesome. Anybody else?
I'm reading The Magician's Nephew.
Oh, right on. Very good. What's your order of Narnia? Are you...
Always chronological in the storyline.
Nice!
Not how it was written.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that approach.
Or when it's Christmas, line was.
You have to.
The season's based.
Right on. I just think it is so cool that we worship a God who came down to earth to participate with and embody his creation. And when he was here, he spent his time telling people stories. So this shows me that stories are incredibly important and that God cares about pursuing our imaginations. And this is actually extremely relational. Oh, no. Oh, yes. Okay. I brought an artifact. So, I'm going to add this to our boat here. So, when me and my sister were kids, our family was living in this little apartment. You know what I'm going to talk about. And as apartment kids, camping wasn't really in our lexicon. And my parents had previously been doing ministry in Russia. So when they moved here, we were starting pretty fresh. I know the budget was pretty tight. But from that apartment, Mom and Dad gave us the best adventures. So my dad would set up this little lamp here. And this one's electric. I'm kind of a poser. The other one was gas. It was cooler. But he'd set it up, and then we'd go camping in the living room. So we'd get our sleeping bags and kind of set up for this big adventure. We'd do marshmallows over candles. That was pretty fun. And Dad would tell us a story. And they were kind of intense stories. I remember a lot of death. But no, it was good. It was we were there. We were ready for battle. Maybe that's why I like war movies. But, yeah. And he was so good at capturing our attention and taking us on these grand adventures. And these are some of the best memories of my life. I'm grateful for that. I also think about my great-grandpapa on the French-Canadian side of my family. So his mom's of Abenaki heritage, and the oral tradition was really important to them. And sadly, I know a lot of that culture and tradition and language was lost to my family during that time period. But storytelling remained deeply important to my grandfather. So he was a farmer, and what he would do was he would invite all of the neighboring families and their kids, which would be very, very many. My grandmother came from a family of 14 children, so imagine that many families gathering together. And then he would give a dramatic reading from The Count of Monte Cristo. And this was like an event that people look forward to. So stories are a gathering place for community, and they are deeply relational. It's why I can't buy into the idea that God is only this controlling deity of rules and restriction. Because if that were so, he could have dropped off a list of rules and called it a day. Just say, do this or else. But we see so much more in his character. He doesn't stop at the 10 Commandments. He dwells amongst his people. He sends Jesus, who in the time leading to his ultimate sacrifice takes the time to stand up in a boat and tell a good story. And so let's think about the stories he told, like the prodigal son. Is everyone here familiar with that story? Is anyone here not familiar with prodigal son? Right on, okay. So basically, the prodigal son is this tale about two brothers and the father. And the one brother says, you know what? I just want to use my inheritance now. So he's like, I want to give it to me now. I'm going to go off, do my own thing. Then, just leave me be, you know? So he goes, squanders it all. Then finds out, obviously, that was not fulfilling for him. He ends up just getting this horrible job feeding pigs, and he's eating with the pigs out of this trough. And he says, you know what? I actually need to go back. So he goes back to the father. His head's hanging low. He's not thinking he's going to be received very well. And the father welcomes him with open arms and wraps him in his robe. The thing is, there's the other brother who stayed around. And he's pretty peeved about this thing because he's like, what? I stayed here the whole time. Why does he deserve this, right? And I just think about how many times we see this narrative in modern films and stories today of the prodigal son, the there and back again, the exile and return narrative. Do you have any that come to mind? I think about Tolkien. We see this a lot in fantasy novels, like The Lost King that returns, right? I think of Tony Stark, his journey to humility, right? I'm going to get very literary on you all. So are there any English majors in the house? No. I'm so sorry. I hope you enjoy this still. Okay. Does anyone know about Gustav Freytag and Freytag's pyramid? So Freytag's pyramid, basically, he described how to tell a perfect story. So there's the beginning, then there's the exposition, then you get to the rising action, Dinos, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement, which is kind of the ending of the story, which a lot of Jesus' stories follow really well. Or I don't know if anyone's heard of Joseph Campbell, but he has this whole book on the hero's journey, and it's basically talking about there's this cyclical story that we see over and over of a hero venturing from the known into the unknown. Then they have a revelation that leads to transformation along their way, and then they return, which is also called the gift of goodness. And so all of this I see jam-packed into this little story of the prodigal son, to the point where we English majors study the heck out of it so we can learn how to tell good stories too. And then we can talk about character study. When Jesus describes his characters, it tugs on my heart because I know those characters. I have been those characters. I have been the son who rebelled to do things my own way, and then I had to eat my humble pie out of a trough. I've also been the jealous brother watching the whole thing play out for someone else and thinking to myself, well, what did they do to receive such a warm welcome? What do I deserve? I've been here the whole time. But then when I hear that, the jealous brother in the story, I feel ashamed because I've learned a truth about myself. But what I also hear in that story is the invitation to enter the Father's arms and to be wrapped in his robes that cover my shame. So we find ourselves in stories. They are invitational and participatory. And stories are an amazing connector. They are relational by nature, just as Jesus is relational by nature. So I went to a talk by Pastor Jess a while ago, who was also here a few weeks ago, which was on apologetics. And it was for the young adults at our church. And I think a lot of us were expecting, here's the 10 amazing scientific facts that prove the existence of like the tomb in this area, like very logical, right? Very rational. And instead it was very simple. And she just encouraged us to tell people stories when talking to people who have questions. And she said that honestly, very rarely will someone hear a scientific fact that makes them want to have a relationship with Jesus. I know it happens sometimes, but it's quite rare. And also, this is an aside, but science and God are not exclusive by any means. We serve a very smart and intelligent God who is the creator of science, and I think naturally would put systems in place for the universe. But getting into factual debates rarely creates a relational connection to the other person in the conversation. So we are called to be witnesses of Christ. And that means we're called to share about what we have witnessed and where we have witnessed Christ in our lives. So we're called to tell that story. So how do we prepare ourselves to do that? What do we need? So we're going to come back to that later. It'll be a surprise. But I think telling someone your story is so beautiful and invitational. Like you're saying, like, hey, look, this is where Jesus is in my story. Look at the big story that I'm a part of. And when we're not confident in telling our stories yet, that's okay. God works on that. I think about the French mystic and writer Madame Guyon, and she wrote a little book on prayer. It's a really good little book if you ever get the chance to read it. And at the beginning she writes, "It is you alone, Lord, who can render this little work of any value by imprinting on it the heart and lending those who read it to seek you within themselves." She puts the onus on God. And so when I'm saying that we all need to become storytellers like Jesus, I am by no means saying that we need to become, I feel like the internet has ruined this word for me, but like the main character. And honestly, what a relief. I think that amount of responsibility would be crushing. And that spot is already taken, thankfully, by our good Lord who will handle it perfectly. And the pressure's off, just like Madame Guyon was saying. It's on Jesus. So someone had mentioned this during the conversations a couple weeks ago. I think it was Crystal. Thanks for coming, Crystal. But she said our privilege is to be a thread in the tapestry. But what's also beautiful to me is that thread matters. That God carefully crafted that thread. And if we look at Psalm 139, "You knitted me in my mother's womb. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast the sum of them. They would outnumber the grains on the sand." So you, as a tiny thread in this tapestry, are deeply loved by their author and creator. So we're called to be witnesses, and we are called to imitate Christ. And what I find so interesting is that when we discuss imitating Christ, we rarely talk about his storytelling. We'll talk about how to imitate prayer and fasting and walking through deserts and the spiritual disciplines, which are all very good. Like, I think that's all very important. But what I don't see come up very often is how to tell a good story. And so I want to explore that together tonight. Will you hop in that boat with me? So in talking about the practice of writing, Stephen King, I'm going to quote Stephen King and Billie Eilish. There's going to be some random quotes today. He says, "The water is free, so drink. Drink and be filled up." And he's quoting Jesus. So that brings us to question 2. What makes a good story? So the answer that I propose is by telling the truth. So that doesn't mean that you should throw away your fiction and only read autobiographies and self-help books and all of those things. Because I also believe that fiction is a great vehicle for honesty, and that these fictional stories have a really special way of accessing truth. So one time I had a meeting with a theater mentor, and she was telling me that a lot of people think that when you write a play, you have to be just as like broad and general as possible because you're afraid of people not relating to it. So oftentimes you're like, oh, I'm not going to get too specific because like, what if this one guy never experienced, I don't know, getting pantsed or something, you know? Like, you have to be really broad. But she said that actually makes for a really boring story. She said that the more specific and the more truthful that you can be, that's where people latch on and say, like C.S. Lewis did, "You too? I thought I was the only one." Okay, let's go back to my anxiety, my favorite place. So the reason I went to theater school, I joined it late, so I joined it halfway through my English Lit degree. And It was because the way I was giving presentations was really freaking my English professors out. This is definitely TMI, but I would like sweating through the paper, throwing up, like every physical symptom of fear that you can imagine, I was experiencing it. And a couple of profs sat me down and they suggested I take an intro to drama class just to give me some confidence in speaking in front of people. And I thought that sounds like the worst idea ever. But I am a teacher's pet, so I will do anything you say. So I'm in. But I didn't expect to love it. And I didn't expect to stay. Because the reason I took literature in the first place was because I love stories. And drama, it was just another vehicle of telling stories. And I also found comfort in it because it gave me a place to hide. Because there's something very different about being Stephanie in front of a crowd versus being somebody else in front of a crowd. If there's a little clown guy in your show, this shows up a lot in Shakespeare. Like, I love being the little clown guy. Just like anything, like nose covers, it's great. Any day. Because it gives me a mask to hide behind. But my profs caught on to this. And I thought I was cruising, but they said, that's not how this works. Because there's a problem with this. So I hear a lot of people say that actors are the best liars because they're so good at pretending. And my acting prof hated that. She said that's so wrong because if you go up there with a mindset that like, I'm lying, I'm tricking everyone, that's just bad acting. The best actors are the best truth tellers because audiences are smart and they can tell when someone's faking it and when they're feigning emotion because it comes across as disingenuous. And it takes you right out of the story. But when an actor is experiencing the truth of the moment, you're pulled in and you buy it. And I just remember in drama school, one of my first times feeling that. So there was a show where the playwright wrote her own adoption story. And this was a really big privilege to be a part of. Like, that was very personal. And there was a scene where the character, she's speaking to her father who passed away. And she's telling him how much she misses him and wishes that he was here to help her through some really tough circumstances. And in rehearsal, I was not doing it very well. Also, somehow, I totally missed the memo that like this was her true story. So I was trying to do this like random character study and like, what is she feeling? And it was just very fake and not very good. And I was just trying to force it. And I just remember the director, who was so smart. First of all, she let me know, hey, this is a true thing. And she told me there's no need to fake it. Like, this is a true moment. First of all, you have the gift of the person who lived through this to be in the room with you. So that's huge. But then she also said, just stand there and just tell the truth. Just be present to what's going on. And that's really scary because then you're like, whoa, this is me actually going through this moment. And now, this situation isn't truthful to me. My dad is alive and well. He's right here. Thank you. Hi, Dad. But the actor playing my dad, he's only about like 5 years older than me, so it is physically impossible for him to be my father. But man, in that scene, like the way he was looking at me, he just gave me this very kind and gentle look. And it's a look that my dad often gives me. And then all of a sudden, I'm just thinking about how much I love my dad. And then I'm thinking about us sitting around that little lamp in our living room and him telling me a story. And I'm thinking about my great-grandfather that I never got to meet and him excitedly reading The Count of Monte Cristo in his farmhouse and what I would say to him if I could. And all of a sudden, we're crying. We're all crying. I'm crying. The profiling, my mom is crying. But we're experiencing the truth in this made-up moment. And so poet Malcolm Guite, he wrote this really great little book. And he says that parables are made-up stories being told by truth himself. So Kelly often says this quote, that the parables are, what is it, fake gardens with real toads in them?
Yeah.
So good. And let's talk about the parables. Like, why did Jesus make stories up? This little book is really good. And Malcolm Guite, he shares that Jesus takes special care about appealing to our imagination, which Guite calls our truth-bearing faculty. So to tell true stories like Jesus did, we need to have eyes to see and ears to hear the truth. We need to engage. That means we need to engage with our truth-bearing faculty. Now I'm going to get even more literary on you guys right now. This is for Anyone in like arts sociology? Yeah, right on. This is for you, Tina. Okay, so Geit gives us some examples. The Romantic poets have a lot to say about this. So heads up, that doesn't mean that they just wrote a bunch of love poetry to their sweethearts. The Romantic poets, they had a way of seeing the world in a romantic way. So they wrote a lot about nature. They're the guys that wrote about like flowers and sunshine. And this is just an aside, but last week we went on a house building trip to the Dominican, and Kelly, you shared a story that made me laugh, but he was walking by a couple of guys that were just having this really lovely conversation, you know? And then the one guy just goes, hey, what's your favorite flower? I think that's so beautiful. Like, that's the kind of romantic poet energy we need in 2025. I'm sick of postmodernism. Bring it back. All right. Romantic poet William Wordsworth calls it awakening the mind's attention. Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes of how we live behind a film of familiarity and selfish solicitude. We have eyes, yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. So I'm going to read more from Matthew 13. You can sit this time, though. And this is right after Jesus finished the parable of the sower. This is from verse 10. His disciples came and asked him, why do you use parables when you talk to the people? He replied, you are permitted to understand the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but others are not. To those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given, and they will have an abundance of knowledge. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. That is why I use the parables. For they look, but they don't really see. They hear, but they don't really listen or understand. This fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah that says, when you hear what I say, you will not understand. When you see what I do, you will not comprehend. For the hearts of these people are hardened, and their ears cannot hear, and they have closed their eyes, so their eyes cannot see, and their ears cannot hear, and their hearts cannot understand, and they cannot turn to me and let me heal them. But blessed are your eyes, because they see, and your ears, because they hear. I tell you the truth. Many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but they didn't see it. And they longed to hear what you hear, but they didn't hear it. Okay, so that's a lot of eyes and ears, like a biblically accurate angel kind of going on. But this is what Coleridge was talking about, right? That film of familiarity and selfish solicitude. It's like when you're so wrapped up in your own world that you can't have the eyes to see the beauty of what God is doing, or the ears to hear what he's speaking. It's all covered up. You get calloused, where you don't have a heart that is soft and moldable, a heart that is willing to turn to him and to experience the healing that he offers. I just remember one time, me and Celeste, that's my sister, we were at Comic Expo, because we're nerds, and we went to watch one speaker, and he was just talking about his new superhero movie. But all of a sudden, he just got up and he just started preaching. He was like, you know what? I believe that God can heal a past moment in your story and use it for the good of your future. And we're like, everyone's wearing blue hair, and we're like, all right, preach. This guy who plays Flynn Rider, like, right on. But that really blessed me because it's so true. When we have that soft, open heart and invite God into our stories, he brings healing into our stories. Think about Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Brooke, you just shared that in the DR. And the thing is, I've experienced some things that are not good. And I know a lot of you have as well. I've had a lot of friends die really young. And I will tell you, I still wrestle with that. In my thinking, their stories were cut short. But I have also seen the goodness of God. And I've seen his kindness and desire to bring healing and restoration in the lives of those around my friends. And I still see that their stories are very important to this day, and they still impact me to this day. And especially now, I can value Jesus' promise of eternity and what his sacrifice actually meant, because that is part of my story. So when Jesus says that the secrets of the kingdom are hidden, they're hidden in plain sight. To see them, we simply need to lift the film of familiarity, the selfish solicitude. I love that word, solicitude. It's like the isolation from our vision so that we can access what the kingdom has to offer, which is Jesus. So C.S. Lewis says that his imagination was baptized. And I love that image. And he says that this actually happened long before he became a Christian. He used to read these fairy stories by this writer. His name's George MacDonald. And he's a writer and poet and Christian minister. And Lewis had said that he had the two hemispheres of his mind, and they were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved and believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So what he learned later on was that the two were not exclusive, that the rational and the poetic, but that Christ offers the both and. So Malcolm Guite writes, the gospel is not in any way imaginary in the dismissive sense of unreal or untrue. On the contrary, it is so real and so true that we need every faculty of mind and body, including our imagination, to apprehend it. That's why the imagination is important. One of my favorite Lewis quotes is from Mere Christianity, where he says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So the key of having eyes to see is first to look at Jesus. And Christ offers the lens for us to view this world and to view our own stories and the stories of those around us in a way that notices what can't be seen without him. So I think about the romantic poets that we talked about and how they noticed the babbling brooks and what's your favorite flower and all those beautiful things. It's when Jesus captures our imagination that we are able to view the world in this way. So this is a lens of hope. And these are not rose-colored glasses. They don't diminish our suffering. It is very clear in the scriptures that Jesus sits with us in our suffering, that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. But like the word says, we grieve and suffer, but not like those who have no hope. And that's why sharing the gospel isn't from this high and mighty posture of I'm right and you're wrong and I'm going to heaven and you're not. It's just about inviting the people that you love into hope and to taste and see that the Lord is good. So this is why stories and our imaginations are so important. Stories also have a formative quality. They form us, the ones we consume, the ones we participate in, the ones we choose to believe, the ones that simply happen to us. In her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. She speaks of how dangerous it is to choose to believe one singular story about a nation or a people that may not even be true or only filled with distorted truths, rather than being open and curious to the beauty of the broader story. And those are the stories that can heal. So this is a different track of thought, but also on formation. So when I was reading Stephen King's book, he has a book called On Writing, and when I picked it up, I was expecting it to just be like, this is how to write. And then I open it, and he starts with, this is my childhood. That kind of weird, but okay. But it was so interesting because he writes about his journey from childhood into adolescence, and then he's talking about every gory injury that he's ever had, every illness, the gross, I threw up and it was disgusting, every near-death experience, and his first job was working for a hospital. And he was doing the laundry, and he was talking about all the bloody sheets that he would get, and they start to rot, so it's there's disgusting. And then I realized he's telling us how he became a horror writer. He's telling us how his life formed him into the stories that he tells now. So again, in Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis writes of his childhood home, and he says that I am a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude. Spare room? I'm just saying. So I read this online, so it must be true. But according to Psychology Today and a peer-reviewed article, I wanted to make sure, an emotion will only last in our body for 90 seconds. So like that physiological response triggered by the stimulus, it dissipates after only 90 seconds. And the only reason why it will perpetuate is because of the story we attach to that emotion. So if we keep ruminating and thinking about it and getting trapped in this thought cycle, we create a feedback loop. And the emotion just keeps going and going and going. So one of my favorite authors, her name is Zadie Smith, and in her book White Teeth, she writes, "Every moment happens twice, inside and outside, and they are two different histories." So what stories do we carry inside that have shaped our histories, that have shaped the way we view our own stories? So as someone who is prone to worry, I see that the stories that I've latched onto, these stories of fear that, like, oh, you're a failure and everything's going to go wrong, and they've definitely contributed to me becoming a far more anxious person than God intended me to be. And I'm grateful to see him working on it. So yes, stories can harm. And I remember something that you brought up, Logan, in the conversations. You were talking about gossip and slander and how that's like a distorted form of stories that are used not for God's good, right? Not for what they were intended for, to encourage and to edify. But stories can also form us in good ways too. So for example, they help us to build empathy. They open our eyes to experiences outside of ourselves and make us aware of those around us. So how are we to love our neighbor if we don't know our neighbor? I think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. That story has had such an impact on our world that it even entered our everyday vernacular. Like when someone says the words Good Samaritan, I think I can almost guarantee that you're not thinking about an exemplary citizen specific to the area of Samaria, but you're just thinking about someone that has empathy, right? Someone that has done a good deed for their neighbor. I think about, it's elementary, dear Watson. Like when a story can do that, when it can enter our language, that's a good story. There's a quote that I love from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, which says, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." So in other words, you can never really understand someone until you know their story. So I want to finish up by talking about the grand story, the meta-narrative, and Jesus as the author. We got there. We're a storyteller, author. I told you. So, what is so beautiful about this faith is that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves, and we are being written into God's narrative. So he even authors our own faith. Like if you look at Hebrews 2:12, I think, Logan, you brought this up in the conversation. I know some translations choose the word pioneers of our faith, but I like that others call him the author of our faith. And this is an aside, but if you're like multilingual and you're interested in translating, Daniel, I know that you're really into this. I think that is awesome. That is such a beautiful art form and like another way of storytelling. I was reading a translated copy of War and Peace, which is too long. That book is too long. But my favorite part was the introduction, where the translator, he was just talking about his process and how he translated this book. And his painstakingly delicate process to try to like capture the full thought of like old Russian language and make it not only understandable, but beautiful to like an Anglophone audience in the modern context. And that's just another facet of how storytelling is so beautiful. The like cross-cultural, communicative nature of language and stories. I think that's really cool. And so that's why I'm grateful for the different translations of the Bible that we have, that we're grappling with the original language of the text to draw the full meaning from it. So when thinking about Jesus as the author, the Stephen King quote, he's back, he keeps coming up for me, and he says, "To write is human, to edit is divine." And I think that's such a good image of what it looks like to invite Christ into our stories and to allow him to edit and heal the narratives that we are living out or the ones that we've believed about ourselves and the world around us. And I know a lot of people can feel some resistance towards that, especially to, if this is new language that you're hearing with words like edit and correct and surrender or submit, it can sound very restrictive. And maybe this is a fault in our restricted use of language. But what I invite you to remember is the broader story and the relational attitude of our God and the invitational posture of our God. I think of something one of my drama profs said. This was when we were in first year. And he was recommending us to take a class with one of my creative writing profs, which was really funny because she was the one that sent me to his class to get some confidence. So I was like, oh, it's full circle. And then he said, when you take classes from a master like her, a lot of people are scared of the corrections that they'll get, the red pen, we call it, because they're worried that she's going to ruin their writing style. And then she's going to make them only copies of her specific taste in writing. But she knows what she's doing, and actually she's guiding you towards sounding more like yourself. So when you finish her class, you're not a copy of your classmates. She just helps you uncover your own unique voice. So this Convergence series that we've been doing, Becoming Like Jesus, it's been so rich. And yes, to become like him, there is the element of surrendering yourself. We talk about dying to yourself, which is real, and it's serious business. But becoming more like Jesus is also, Bob would always say this, becoming more like yourself. Stepping into the fullness of God who created you uniquely. And you're no longer weighed down by anxiety or jealousy or grief or the troubles of this world. And to let those good seeds take root and to soften your heart. To be covered in the robes of the Father who knows us intrinsically. A friend said this to me the other day, and it really touched me. And she said, to be deeply loved is to be deeply known. Every single part of our story. So when we tell our stories, we participate in something greater than ourselves. We enter a kind of mystery. Writers talk about this phenomena all the time, and it's interesting because you hear it from everybody. So I'm like, okay, there's something going on here. And basically writers say, well, I started working on my story, but then the characters started taking over, and unexpected events started happening, and things I never planned, and I'm like, whoa, the story's gotten away from me. And I think that there is something mysterious about that practice, about telling a story. Author Annie Dillard, she writes, at its best, the sensation of writing is that of any unmerited grace. It is handed to you, but only if you look for it. Nice to see. You search, you break your heart, your back, your brain, and then, and only then, it is handed to you. From the corner of your eye, you see motion. Something is moving through the air and headed your way. It is a parcel bound in ribbons and bows. It has 2 white wings. It flies directly at you. You can read your name on it. 1 line of a poem, the poet says. Only 1 line, but thank God for that 1 line. It drops from the ceiling. Billie Eilish. I remember watching a songwriter's table talk, and Billie Eilish, she was talking about her process in writing What Was I Made For, the song from the Barbie movie. And I don't know if you guys had the same experience with that song that I did. Maybe I was having like my girl summer moment. I weep. Like, you cannot play that song without me absolutely losing it. And at the table talk, another artist asked her, he was like, how did you write this? And she said kind of jokingly, she goes, I think it was God. And everyone laughed, but there was 2 artists that were people of faith at the table, and I could just see them being like, nodding incessantly, like, yes, that is correct. Because she's describing about how her and her brother, they were trying to write their new album, and they were completely stuck. And they just, like, at this point wanted to quit the industry entirely. They said, we're washed up, we have no more creativity, we're done. And then her brother suggested, well, like, let's just try the Barbie song. And they sit down, and they wrote it in 15 minutes, because the first thing that they asked was the question, what was I made for? And the word simply came. So that is the mystery that we are invited into. In his book, The Divine Dance, Richard Rohr, another writer I love, he writes, remember, mystery isn't something that you cannot understand. It is something that you can endlessly understand. There is no point at which you can say, I've got it. Always and forever, mystery gets you. And to think that we are fully known by the endlessly knowable. So I'm going to start wrapping this up. When I was struggling with what to say for this talk, the first scripture that came to my mind was Revelation 12:11. So it's, they triumphed over him, which is the enemy, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And so what I find so interesting is that when the Bible outlines how we overcome the enemy and how we overcome evil, it's by the sacrifice of Jesus and by telling a true story. So I worked at this really great summer camp for many years and got to help lead this 2-week, it was an introduction to leadership camp for 14-year-olds, which was awesome because like they barely know who they are as people. And then all of a sudden they're like, what am I going to do when I'm in charge of people one day? And they're imagining these crazy scenarios. It was awesome. Like, you're just your babies. It's okay. They're like, what am I? I'm a CEO. So a really good object lesson, I love an object lesson, was we set up a punching bag in the barn. And we read this passage of scripture. And we asked them to think about a lie that they believe about themselves. And then when they come to the punching bag, that they should speak truth to it instead and use their truth as a weapon, to know that they're covered in the blood and that they have the word of their testimony. The boys were not into it for some reason. Like, I thought this was the key to their hearts, and they hated it. But what surprised me was the girls were just in there, and it was awesome. And you'd hear the sweetest things from, like, the quietest little voices. And you go like, I am smart, and I am brave, and I am beautiful. And my favorite was, I am loved. And especially after knowing their stories and what they've been through, hearing those things coming from inside of them is one of the greatest gifts I've ever experienced in my life. So yes, I have wrestled with the idea of being up here for months and just being in front of people because the story that I believed was that I don't have anything worth saying. Like, get Cody up here, get Jess, literally anybody else. But I just kept feeling the Holy Spirit say, you have a story to tell. Tell a true story. You have a story to tell. Tell it with joy and confidence and conviction because it matters. It glorifies God. In one of the first parables Jesus preaches, he asks, would anyone light a lamp and then put it under a basket or a bed? Oh no, this is not going as smoothly as I hoped. Of course not. A lamp is placed on a stand where its light will shine. For everything that is hidden will eventually be brought into the open, and every secret will be brought into the light. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. So by inviting the light of Christ into your story, not only will it shine for others around you, but you'll be given the eyes to see the secrets of the kingdom and the access to participate in the divine mystery of the love of God. So like the parable we read at the beginning, may those seeds, those kernels of truth that the Lord is sowing, find fertile soil and take root in your heart and inspire your imaginations and tell good stories. So I'm going to invite the worship team back up again. I was an avid churchgoer between the ages of 2 and 4 in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I love ending off with a good hymn and an altar call. Probably not a full-on altar call, but like a hymn and a prayer. But if any of you need prayer, we would love to pray with you. Maybe it is for the eyes to see the stories in your life. Maybe it's for the confidence to tell your story or healing over a part of your story. And I just love the idea of standing up and telling a true story as a community, of declaring, this is my story, this is my song as a group, all in the same boat, where we can say, you too? So I invite you to stand up again with me, and let's sing this together.
Wow, what a word, what a story, and what a God we serve. I dare say this is probably one of my favorite Convergence talks this whole year. I hope this has blessed you as much as it's blessed me, and hope to see you next time as we talk about becoming like Jesus, the Artisan. See you there.